Thanks. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Need to see identification and proof of legal status.
I'm a licensed attorney. Texas State Bar, Victoria Benjamin, my identification.
Everyone says there's something. Got documentation proving citizenship right now?
My driver's license is in my wallet.
15 years practicing law?
All the state bar in Texas.
The supermarket parking lot was bathed in April morning sunlight when Keisha Matthews finished loading her groceries into the trunk of her white SUV. She had stopped quickly to grab a few items before an important meeting with a client, wearing professional clothes, her mind already reviewing the legal arguments she'd need to present that afternoon. She had no idea that in the next 20 minutes, she would herself become the center of an incident that would expose blatant racial discrimination and cost the federal government over $1 million in one of the most significant settlements involving racial profiling by federal agents. Two men approached her as she closed her trunk, both wearing vests marked with large ICE letters. They didn't ask if she needed help, didn't offer a friendly greeting. Instead, their first words were a demand. They wanted to see her immigration documents. Keisha, a 36-year-old black woman born and raised in Texas, a licensed attorney with a degree from one of the country's top law schools, froze for a moment trying to process why federal agents were demanding proof of her citizenship in a supermarket parking lot in broad daylight. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, leave in the comments where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button because what happened next was captured on body cam and proved beyond any doubt that racial profiling isn't just something that happens in obscure places or ambiguous situations, but can happen to any black person anywhere, even when you're a lawyer buying groceries in broad daylight. The agent's body camera captured every second of what followed, and that footage would become the most damning evidence in a federal lawsuit that exposed not just the misconduct of two individual agents, but a systematic pattern of ICE operations, targeting communities based purely on how people looked. Keisha didn't know yet, but her legal background and her refusal to be intimidated were about to transform a humiliating encounter into a legal precedent that would change how federal agents could conduct stops in public spaces. The two agents, whose names would soon become nationally known for all the worst reasons, were Daniel Kraus and Stephen Morrison. Kraus was the older one, with 15 years at ICE and a history of aggressive operations that had generated complaints but never serious consequences. Morrison was younger, only 3 years with the agency, but had already adopted the same confrontational approach his more experienced partner modeled. They had been patrolling that parking lot for 2 hours that morning, part of a targeted operation in a neighborhood that, in the words of their own internal documents, had a high concentration of Latino and black-appearing residents. When Keisha asked why they were asking for her documents, Kraus's response was revealing in its accidental honesty. He said they were conducting routine checks of people who looked like they might be non-citizens. Keisha, with years of experience in constitutional law, immediately recognized that what he had just admitted was explicit racial profiling, but she kept her voice calm and polite as she explained she was an American citizen, born in Texas, and that there was no legal basis for demanding she prove this while loading groceries into her car. Kraus's reaction to being questioned was immediate and aggressive. His voice rose, his tone shifted from cold professionalism to barely disguised hostility. He told Keisha she needed to cooperate, or there would be consequences. Morrison, his partner, began circling around Keisha's car as if looking for something suspicious, peering through the windows, writing down her license plate, creating an intimidating atmosphere designed to make people comply through fear rather than legitimate legal authority. That's when Keisha did something that would completely change the trajectory of this encounter. She calmly stated loud enough for the body cam to clearly capture that she was a licensed attorney, that she knew her constitutional rights, and that these agents were engaging in illegal racial profiling without probable cause or reasonable suspicion. She said she was not consenting to any search, that she was not legally required to provide immigration documentation as an American citizen shopping for groceries, and that she was documenting this encounter for possible legal action. The expression on Kraus's face changed when she said she was a lawyer, a micro-expression of alarm that the body cam captured perfectly before he could compose his features. He tried to backtrack slightly, saying they were just asking routine questions, but Keisha cut him off. She asked directly whether she was being detained or if she was free to leave. The question, phrased with legal precision that made clear she knew exactly what she was doing, put Kraus in an impossible position. Detaining. Her without probable cause would be clearly illegal, but letting her go would mean admitting he had no basis for stopping her in the first place. Other shoppers in the parking lot had noticed the confrontation, and several had stopped to watch or record on their own phones, creating multiple independent records of what was happening. An elderly white woman with a shopping cart stopped and asked loudly if Keisha was okay, if she needed help. The question was kind, but also revealing. Even this stranger could see there was something fundamentally wrong about federal agents surrounding a well-dressed black woman in a supermarket parking lot demanding papers for no apparent reason. Krause ignored the elderly woman, who had asked if Keisha was okay, and focused his attention entirely on Keisha, his frustration visibly growing with each second she refused to be intimidated. He repeated his demand for identification, this time framing it as a routine investigation that gave him authority to ask questions. Keisha, her voice remaining calm but firm, responded with legal precision that completely disarmed him. She explained that mere routine questions created no legal obligation to answer, that the Fourth Amendment protected against unreasonable searches and seizures, and that stopping her without articulable suspicion of criminal activity constituted illegal seizure. Morrison tried a different tactic, moving closer and saying that if she had nothing to hide, she should simply cooperate and make things easy for everyone. It was the classic line used by law enforcement to make people surrender their rights. The implication that exercising constitutional rights was somehow suspicious in itself. But Keisha had taught about this exact fallacy in civil rights workshops she had conducted for community organizations. She responded that constitutional rights weren't conditional on convenience, that she didn't need to prove innocence because citizens were presumed innocent, and that cooperating with illegal demands set dangerous precedent. The body cam captured the exact moment Krause made the decision that would eventually cost him his career and the government over $1 million. Instead of acknowledging he had no legal basis to continue the encounter, instead of simply letting Keisha leave and admitting he had made a mistake, he escalated. He told Keisha that if she refused to cooperate, he would have to detain her for obstruction of a federal investigation. The words were ill-chosen and legally absurd. You cannot obstruct an investigation simply by refusing to answer questions when there's no legal basis for the questions in the first place. Keisha responded immediately, her voice rising slightly, not with fear, but with controlled indignation that was powerful precisely because it was so clearly justified. She said loudly for the benefit of cameras and witnesses that she was being threatened with arrest for exercising her constitutional rights, that she had committed no crime, that she was simply shopping for groceries while black, and that this was exactly the kind of racial profiling ICE claimed not to engage in. She stated again her identity as a licensed attorney and added that she specialized in civil rights and was intimately familiar with cases involving federal misconduct. The mention of her specialization in civil rights should have been the final warning for Krause to back down. But his own arrogance and perhaps years of never facing consequences for similar tactics blinded him to the hole he was digging. He told Morrison to check Keisha's car plates, look for outstanding warrants or anything they could use to justify their stop. Morrison walked to their vehicle and began running the plate through the system, while Krause remained close to Keisha, his posture still aggressive, his hand occasionally resting on his belt, near where law enforcement equipment was attached. Other shoppers continued to gather, some obviously recording on cell phones, others simply watching with growing discomfort at what was happening. A middle-aged Hispanic man approached and asked the agents directly what crime Keisha had committed that justified detaining her. Krause turned on him and said aggressively that he needed to back up and move away, or he too would be detained for interfering with a federal operation. The threat was captured perfectly on the body cam, another piece of evidence of the pattern of intimidation these agents routinely used. Keisha used the moment Krause was distracted threatening the other witness to pull out her own phone and begin recording as well. She calmly narrated for her own camera what was happening, stating the date, time, location, and the names of the agents she had managed to see on their identification. She described how she had been approached without cause, how her refusal to answer illegal questions had resulted in threats of detention, and how multiple witnesses were present to confirm she was simply loading groceries when she was targeted for racial profiling. Morrison returned from the vehicle after checking the plate and had to admit there were no warrants, no red flags, nothing indicating any problem with Keisha or her vehicle. The plate was registered to her, the car wasn't stolen, and her driver's license was valid and current. It was the expected result for someone who was exactly who she said she was, an American citizen doing nothing wrong. But even this confirmation wasn't enough to make Kraus back down from his untenable position. He switched tactics again, now claiming that Keisha's behavior, specifically her refusal to cooperate and her recording of the encounter, was in itself suspicious and justified further investigation. It was circular logic at its worst, transforming the exercise of rights into evidence of criminality. Keisha pointed out exactly that, noting for the cameras that the agent was now arguing that knowing and asserting her constitutional rights made her suspicious, an argument no court in the country would uphold. The standoff continued for another 10 minutes, with Kraus seemingly unable to accept that he had no authority to force Keisha to do anything. He consulted with Morrison in low voices, probably debating whether they should just arrest her on something fabricated or finally let her go. The body cam didn't capture their private conversation, but did capture the body language, the frustration, the gradual realization that, with so many cameras rolling and so many witnesses present, any move they made would be scrutinized. A local police cruiser appeared, called by someone in the parking lot who had dialed 911 to report federal agents harassing an innocent woman. The local officer, a black man in uniform, who immediately assessed the situation with experienced eyes, approached and asked what the problem was. Kraus began explaining they were conducting immigration checks, but the local officer cut him off and asked if they had a warrant or probable cause. When Kraus hesitated, the officer turned to Keisha and asked if she was being detained against her will. Keisha succinctly explained what had happened, how she had been approached for no reason while loading groceries, how she had politely declined to answer questions without legal basis, and how the agents had escalated and threatened to arrest her for exercising her rights. The local officer, whose badge identified him as Officer James Carter, listened silently and then turned to the ICE agents with an expression that made clear he wasn't impressed with what he was hearing. He told them that if they didn't have probable cause or a warrant, they needed to let the lady go, or he'd have to report this as illegal detention. The presence of another law enforcement officer, especially one who clearly wasn't just going to back up his federal colleagues without question, changed the calculus for Kraus. He finally, reluctantly, told Keisha she was free to go, but not before adding that they would be watching the area and that she should expect more questions if they saw her again. It was a veiled threat, a last-ditch attempt to assert some kind of authority even while backing down, and it was captured clearly on the body cam for all to hear. Keisha didn't let that threat pass unchallenged. She stated loudly that she had been coming to this supermarket regularly for years, that she had every right to continue shopping there, and that any future harassment without legal cause would be added to the lawsuit she was definitely filing against these agents and their agency. Then she turned to Officer Carter and asked for his name and badge number so she could include him as a witness in her formal complaint. Carter promptly provided his information and offered to write his own report of the incident if it would help. As Keisha got in her car and drove away, her hand was trembling slightly on the steering wheel, the adrenaline finally hitting now that the immediate threat had passed. But her mind was already working in lawyer mode, mentally reviewing every detail of what had happened, every word that was said, every witness who was present. She knew she had a textbook civil rights case, perhaps one of the clearest examples of racial profiling by federal agents she had ever encountered. What she didn't know yet was how big this case would become, or how the body cam footage that captured everything would become an educational tool used in law enforcement academies across the country, as an example of exactly what not to do. Keisha drove directly to her office after leaving the parking lot, canceling her client meeting and explaining an urgent legal emergency had arisen that required immediate attention. She didn't mention to the client that the emergency was her own case, that she had become a victim of the exact type of civil rights violation she spent her professional days fighting. As soon as she arrived at the office, she downloaded the video she had recorded on her phone to multiple backup locations, aware that digital evidence could disappear or be corrupted, and that this video would be crucial for any legal action she pursued. Then she began documenting everything while it was still fresh in her memory. Every word exchanged, every threat made, every witness who had stopped to watch or record. She wrote detailed descriptions of the two agents, their demeanor, their body language, the identification numbers she had managed to capture. She noted Officer Carter's badge number and made a mental note to contact him for a formal statement. Her hands were still trembling slightly as she typed, the reality of what had happened hitting in waves, the anger and humiliation mixing with professional determination to turn this violation into legal precedent that could prevent it from happening to others. Within hours, she began receiving calls. Officer Carter called first, explaining he had written a detailed report of the incident and would be happy to provide a statement or testify if needed. He mentioned that in his 15 years on the force, he had seen many cases of racial profiling, but rarely one so blatant or so well documented. His willingness to speak out was encouraging, reminding Keisha that not all law enforcement officers protected each other, regardless of what was right. Then some of the witnesses from the parking lot began calling, having gotten Keisha's contact information from business cards she always carried and had distributed before leaving. The elderly woman who had first asked if Keisha was okay called and identified herself as Margaret Sullivan, a retired teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. Margaret was in tears as she apologized for not doing more to intervene, saying she had watched the entire interaction and been horrified by the treatment Keisha received. She had recorded the last 10 minutes of the encounter on her phone and offered to send the footage to Keisha immediately. Her voice shook when she said she never imagined seeing this kind of blatant racism happening so openly in her community, and that she would do anything she could to help Keisha hold those agents accountable. The Hispanic man who had questioned the agents and been threatened for doing so also reached out. His name was Carlos Mendoza, a small business owner in the area who had himself had multiple encounters with ICE over the years, despite being an American citizen born in Los Angeles. He told Keisha that seeing what happened to her brought back memories of his own experiences being stopped and questioned based purely on his appearance. He had recorded the entire interaction on his phone, starting from the moment he noticed the agents approaching Keisha, and he was eager to share that footage and testify about what he witnessed. By nightfall that day, Keisha had statements from 5 different witnesses, 4 separate videos of the incident from multiple angles, her own detailed account, and Officer Carter's official report. She had more documentation and corroborating evidence than most civil rights cases ever managed to assemble, but she also had something more valuable, the agent's own body cam that by law would have to be preserved and eventually made available through legal discovery. That footage, capturing the entire encounter from the agent's perspective, including their private conversations and reactions, would be the centerpiece of evidence that would make this case indefensible. She spent that evening researching relevant precedents, reviewing cases about racial profiling by federal agents, stops without probable cause, and the specific standards of liability for IICE agents conducting operations in public spaces. What she found both strengthened her case and revealed how systemic the problem was. There were dozens of documented cases of ICE agents conducting exactly the type of racial profiling operations she had experienced, but most never resulted in meaningful accountability because victims didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively, or because the lack of clear documentation made it difficult to prove what had happened. Keisha's case was different. She was an attorney specialized in exactly this area of law. She had multiple videos from multiple angles. She had credible witnesses, including a police officer who had witnessed the end of the encounter and confirmed there was no legal basis for the stop. And most importantly, the agent's body cam would provide an unquestionable record not just of their actions, but of their own words admitting they were stopping people based on how they looked. It was the kind of case civil rights lawyers dreamed of having, one where the evidence was so clear and so damning that no amount of government resources or legal maneuvering could obscure the truth of what had happened. The next morning, Keisha contacted several fellow civil rights attorneys she knew from conferences and previous collaborative work. She wanted input on strategy, wanted to ensure she wasn't letting her personal anger cloud her professional judgment about how to proceed. To her relief, but not surprise, every lawyer she spoke with was immediately outraged on her behalf and eager to help. 2 offered to join the case as co-counsel without fee, recognizing this had potential to set important precedents. 1 connected her with national civil rights groups that had resources to support major federal litigation. The local American Civil Liberties Union reached out after hearing about the incident through the Civil Rights Attorney Network. They offered not just legal support, but also help with media attention, recognizing that cases like this gain traction, not just in courtrooms, but in the court of public opinion. The ACLU's regional director, a woman named Patricia Chen, with 20 years of civil rights litigation experience, reviewed the evidence Keisha had collected and said flatly that this was one of the strongest cases of racial profiling by federal agents she had seen in her entire career. Meanwhile, on the ICE side, damage control attempts had already begun, though in ways that would make things much worse for the agents involved. Krause and Morrison had reported the encounter to their supervisors, but their version of events was dramatically different from the reality captured on camera. They claimed Keisha had been hostile and uncooperative from the start, that she had refused to answer basic routine questions, and that they had had reasonable suspicion she might be a non-citizen based on unspecified factors that had nothing to do with race. They omitted mentioning the multiple witnesses, omitted mentioning the intervention of the local police officer, and, crucially, seemed to have forgotten their own body cams had captured everything. The supervisors, operating under the assumption this was just another complaint that would disappear like so many others, filed the report with minimal review. They didn't pull the body cam footage to verify the agent's version of events. They didn't conduct follow-up interviews with witnesses. They didn't contact the local police department to obtain Officer Carter's report. They simply accepted their agent's word and marked the case as resolved. This failure of proper oversight would become a centerpiece of the institutional liability Keisha would seek, proving the problem wasn't just two rogue agents but a departmental culture that allowed and encouraged this behavior. Keisha filed her formal complaint with ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility 1 week after the incident, attaching all video evidence, witness statements, and a detailed timeline of events. She also filed a complaint with the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General, the oversight agency that supposedly provided independent checks on misconduct within DHS and its sub-agencies. Both complaints included language making clear she was an attorney, that she understood her rights, and that she intended to pursue not just administrative remedies but also civil legal action if the violations weren't appropriately addressed. The initial response from both agencies was exactly the kind of standard form letter that victims of federal misconduct typically received, acknowledging receipt of the complaint, promising a thorough investigation, asking for patience while they followed appropriate processes. The letters offered no timeline, provided no substance about how the investigation would be conducted, and made no acknowledgement that what had happened to Keisha might have been improper. They were bureaucratic documents designed to make complainants feel heard while actually promising nothing. But Keisha wasn't a typical complainant waiting passively for a government agency to decide whether to take her complaint seriously. 2 weeks after filing the administrative complaints, she filed a federal lawsuit in district court alleging civil rights violations under multiple legal theories. She sued the two agents individually for violation of her Fourth Amendment rights, false arrest, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and racial discrimination. She sued ICE as an agency for failure to properly train and supervise its agents, for maintaining policies that allowed racial profiling, and for a pattern and practice of conducting stops based on race. And she sued the federal government more broadly under the Bivens, doctrine that allows citizens to sue individual federal officers for constitutional violations. The complaint she filed was a masterpiece of legal writing, 73 pages of meticulously constructed allegations, supported by citations to dozens of relevant cases. She didn't just detail what had happened to her, but placed that incident in the larger context of systematic racial profiling by immigration enforcement. She cited academic studies about the disproportionate rates at which people of color were stopped by IICA. She referenced leaked internal documents showing agents were encouraged to conduct stops in areas with high concentrations of certain ethnic groups. She built a case not just about one bad stop, but about the institutionalization of racial discrimination within the very structure of how immigration enforcement was conducted. News of the lawsuit spread quickly through civil rights networks and immigration advocacy communities. Within days, the story was picked up by local media outlets, with investigative reporters eager to cover a case that had all the elements of a major story. Federal agents filmed conducting blatant racial profiling against an attorney who knew exactly her rights, and had evidence to prove every allegation she made. The first article published included clips from witness video showing the confrontation, and public reaction was immediate and fierce. People were outraged that this could happen in broad daylight in a supermarket parking lot, that a clearly innocent woman could be harassed and threatened simply for her appearance. National media soon followed, with major publications running feature stories about the case. What made it especially compelling for journalists was the availability of multiple video recordings from different angles, all telling the same story of indefensible racial profiling. News stations played clips of Keisha calmly but firmly asserting her rights, while the agents became increasingly aggressive. They showed Officer Carter's intervention, a local policeman having to remind federal agents about basic constitutional requirements, and they highlighted the fact that Keisha wasn't just an ordinary victim, but a civil rights attorney specialized in exactly this type of case, giving her a unique platform to articulate why what happened to her mattered. ICE initially tried its standard strategy of not commenting on pending litigation, but media pressure became too intense to ignore completely. They issued a statement saying they took all allegations of misconduct seriously and were conducting a thorough review of the incident. The statement carefully avoided admitting any wrongdoing while trying to appear responsive to concerns. But the generic statement did little to calm growing public outrage, especially as more details about the two agents' histories began emerging through public records requests filed by news organizations and advocacy groups. Investigative journalists discovered that Krause, the older agent, had at least 7 previous complaints filed against him by various individuals, alleging racial profiling or excessive use of force during stops. None of these complaints had resulted in significant disciplinary action. Some were dismissed as unfounded, others were sustained, but resulted in nothing more than warning letters in his personnel file. The pattern suggested not only that Krause had engaged in this type of behavior before, but that the agency knew about it and had consistently failed to do anything meaningful to correct it or prevent future incidents. Morrison, the younger agent, had a shorter history, but already showed concerning signs. 2 complaints had been filed against him in just 3 years, both alleging he had been overly aggressive during routine stops. One of those complaints came from a Latino man who had been stopped while walking to work and questioned about his immigration status, despite being an American citizen born in the United States. That complaint had been filed with the finding that Morrison had followed proper protocol, a finding that now seemed highly questionable given the circumstances of Keisha's stop. Legal discovery began 3 months after the lawsuit was filed, and it was during this phase that Keisha's case went from strong to absolutely overwhelming. Her legal team subpoenaed the body cam footage from both agents, and when they finally received and reviewed it, they found even more damning material than they had expected. The cameras had captured not just the interaction with Keisha, but also audio of the agents discussing their strategy before approaching her. In that pre-stop conversation, Krause could be heard telling Morrison they should focus on people who looked like they didn't belong in the neighborhood, a transparent euphemism for racial profiling. The body cams also captured multiple other stops the agents had made that same morning before approaching Keisha. In every case, the people stopped were Black or Latino. In every case, the agents demanded identification and immigration documentation without articulating any specific suspicion of criminal activity. Several of these people had simply complied, providing identification and answering questions even though they weren't legally required to do so, not realizing they had the right to refuse. The footage created an unquestionable visual record of a pattern of racial profiling, not just an isolated incident, but systematic practice. Even more damaging, the body cams captured a conversation between Krause and Morrison after they let Keisha leave. They discussed how she had been difficult and how they should have found a way to arrest her, just to teach her a lesson. Krause commented that people who knew their rights were the worst because they made their job harder. Morrison laughed and suggested they should have checked her car more carefully, maybe found some technical violation they could use. The conversation revealed not just that the agents knew their initial stop lacked legal basis, but that they were actively discussing how they could have fabricated justification to arrest someone whose only offense was knowing and asserting her constitutional rights. Keisha's legal team also subpoenaed internal ICE communications related to operations in the area where she had been stopped. These documents revealed the agency had specifically targeted that neighborhood for what they called enhanced enforcement operations, based on demographic data showing a high percentage of immigrant residents. The internal documents never used explicitly racial language, but the implication was clear. They were targeting neighborhoods based on the ethnic composition of their residents, and then conducting broad stops of people in those neighborhoods who looked like they might be undocumented immigrants. More revealing still, discovery uncovered that ILCE supervisors had been warned about Krause's problematic behavior multiple times by other agents who were uncomfortable with his tactics. 3 different officers had filed internal reports over the previous 2 years, expressing concern that Krause was engaging in racial profiling and encouraging other agents to do the same. These concerns had been consistently dismissed by upper-level management with various excuses. That Krause was an experienced veteran agent who understood the job, that his arrest rates were good, so his methods must be effective, that complaints from members of the public weren't reliable because people often lied to avoid deportation. Keisha's attorneys deposed multiple people, including the 2 agents, their supervisors, and several of the other individuals who had been stopped by the same agents on previous occasions. The depositions were devastating for the defense. Krause and Morrison gave inconsistent accounts of what had happened, contradicting not just each other, but also video evidence that clearly showed what had occurred. When confronted with audio from their own body cams discussing targeting people based on appearance, both claimed they had been misunderstood, or that comments had been taken out of context, but their explanations were transparently weak. The supervisors who had ignored previous complaints about Krause also performed poorly in their depositions. When asked why they hadn't taken disciplinary action after multiple complaints, they had no good answers. When presented with internal reports from other agents expressing concerns about racial profiling, they claimed not to remember seeing those reports or not considering them credible. When asked about the agency's policies on stops and probable cause, their answers were vague and evasive, suggesting they themselves didn't fully understand the legal requirements they were supposed to enforce. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from the other individuals who had been stopped by Krause and Morrison on previous occasions. Keisha's team had tracked down 5 people who appeared in the body cam footage being stopped the same morning as Keisha. All were people of color. All described similar experiences of being approached for no apparent reason and questioned about immigration status. Some had provided documentation proving they were citizens, after which the agents simply walked away without explanation or apology. Others had been too intimidated to refuse to answer questions, even knowing they had the right to do so. One man, a black military veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, cried during his deposition while describing the humiliation of being treated like a criminal suspect in his own neighborhood. Keisha's legal team also brought expert witnesses to establish the broader context of racial profiling in immigration enforcement. A sociologist testified about studies showing disproportionate rates at which Black and Latino people were stopped by ICE compared to whites, even controlling for other factors. A former ICE agent who had left the agency over ethical concerns testified about the unofficial culture within some units of encouraging agents to use appearance as a primary factor in deciding who to stop. A constitutional law professor explained in detail why what had happened to Keisha was a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment and established legal precedents about racial profiling. The government tried its own defense strategy, arguing the agents had reasonable suspicion based on a totality of circumstances they couldn't fully articulate, but that existed. They brought experts in immigration enforcement, who testified that agents frequently had to make quick judgments based on subtle factors that were difficult to explain verbally. They argued the agents' training emphasized following intuition, and that sometimes intuition involved making assessments based on appearance among other factors. It was a weak defense that essentially admitted to racial profiling while trying to frame it as a necessary enforcement tool. The case's judge, Federal Judge Maria Gonzalez, was visibly unimpressed with the government's defense. During hearings, she asked multiple pointed questions of government attorneys about how they would distinguish between what happened to Keisha and explicitly prohibited racial profiling. She noted that if appearance could be used as a factor, then effectively any person of color could be stopped at any time without actual suspicion of crime. She cited landmark civil rights cases about why this type of discrimination was unconstitutional, regardless of how convenient it might be for law enforcement. As the discovery phase deepened and more evidence emerged, the government's position became increasingly untenable. Federal attorneys began making discreet signals they were interested in discussing settlement, though publicly they continued defending their agents' actions. Keisha and her legal team knew they had built such a strong case that taking it to trial would likely result in a devastating verdict against the government. But settlements also had their advantages. A settlement could be reached more quickly, would spare Keisha the additional stress of testifying at public trial, and could potentially include structural changes in policies beyond just monetary compensation. Initial settlement negotiations began almost a year after the lawsuit was filed. The government initially offered an amount Keisha's team considered insultingly low, accompanied by settlement language that would admit no wrongdoing and include a broad confidentiality clause preventing Keisha from speaking publicly about the case. She rejected that offer immediately. This wasn't about money for her. It had never been about money. It was about accountability, about public acknowledgement that her rights had been violated, and about forcing changes that could prevent others from experiencing what she had gone through. She made clear any settlement would have to include admission of misconduct, would have to be substantial enough to send a message that this behavior had real consequences, and could not include gag provisions that would prevent her from speaking about her experience. During this period, the case continued attracting media attention, especially when clips from the body cam footage began leaking to the press through channels that were never officially identified, but that everyone suspected were sympathizers within the agency itself, who were horrified by what the cameras had captured, seeing and hearing Krause and Morrison discussing how they should have found a way to arrest. Keisha, to teach her a lesson, created a new wave of public outrage. Civil rights organizations held protests outside ICE offices in multiple cities, demanding not just justice for Keisha, but comprehensive reforms of how immigration enforcement was conducted. Members of Congress began asking questions about the case. Several representatives and senators, particularly those from districts with large immigrant populations, or those who had been vocal about immigration reform, sent letters to the Department of Homeland Security, demanding explanations about how this incident could have occurred, and what measures were being taken to prevent future cases of racial profiling. Some even called for hearings on ICE enforcement practices, using Keisha's case as a prime example of why greater oversight and accountability were needed. The political attention added another layer of pressure on the government to resolve the case in a way that demonstrated they took the issue seriously. The two agents, at the center of the case, faced their own consequences even before any settlement was reached. Krause was placed on unpaid administrative leave pending the outcome of the case, effectively ending his career, practically even if officially still employed. Morrison was demoted and transferred to a desk position with no field enforcement responsibilities. Both faced separate criminal investigations for the perjury they had committed during their depositions when their accounts of events contradicted what body cam footage clearly showed. Though prosecutors eventually decided not to file criminal charges, citing the difficulty of proving criminal intent beyond reasonable doubt, the threat of those investigations hung over both agents as a reminder their actions had consequences going beyond the civil lawsuit. Other ICE agents who had worked with Krause and Morrison, or who had witnessed their tactics, began coming forward publicly, some anonymously, and others using their real names. They described a culture within certain ICE units where racial profiling wasn't just tolerated, but actively encouraged by supervisors who cared more about arrest numbers than constitutional compliance. One agent, a Latina woman who had worked for ICE for 8 years before leaving over ethical concerns, gave a detailed interview describing how she had been criticized by her supervisors for not stopping enough people who looked illegal, a term that was transparent code for targeting based on racial appearance. This whistleblower's story, and others like it, created a portrait of a systemic problem that went far beyond two rogue agents. It revealed that what had happened to Keisha wasn't an aberration, but the logical result of policies and culture that prioritized enforcement numbers over constitutional rights. The story became less about one individual incident and more about the need for fundamental reform of how federal enforcement agencies operated in communities of color. Civil rights organizations began using Keisha's case as the centerpiece in their broader advocacy campaigns for legislative changes that would increase oversight of immigration enforcement. Meanwhile, Keisha had become a public voice on racial profiling and immigration enforcement reform. She gave lectures at law schools, spoke at civil rights conferences, and wrote op-eds for major publications about her experience and the broader issues it highlighted. She was particularly effective as a spokesperson because she could speak both from the personal perspective of having experienced the trauma of being profiled and from the professional perspective of understanding the legal arguments and policy frameworks that allowed this behavior to continue. Her articulation and credibility made it difficult for defenders of the status quo to dismiss her criticisms. Settlement negotiations continued for several months, with offers and counteroffers flowing between the two parties. The monetary amount being discussed continued climbing as the government realized Keisha and her team were genuinely prepared to take the case to trial if they didn't get acceptable terms. But the non-monetary issues proved even more contentious. Keisha's team insisted any settlement had to include a structural reform component, real changes in how ICE conducted operations in public spaces. The government resisted this strongly, arguing that policy changes shouldn't be dictated by litigation settlements, but rather made through normal administrative processes. Judge Gonzalez, watching the settlement talks proceed slowly, made clear at several status conferences that she thought both parties should work in good faith to reach resolution. She noted that the evidence she had seen in motions and arguments made it likely a jury would find for Keisha on all or most claims, and that the damages award could significantly exceed what was being discussed in settlement talks. She also noted that a public trial would put even more spotlight on ICE enforcement practices in ways the government would likely find uncomfortable. Her observations were clearly meant to encourage the government to make a more realistic settlement offer. The pressure worked. 18 months after the initial incident, the parties reached a preliminary settlement that was substantial in every respect. The monetary compensation to Keisha was over $1 million, one of the largest amounts ever paid in an individual racial profiling case against federal agents. But equally important, the settlement included specific non-monetary terms. ICE agreed to review and revise its policies on stops in public spaces, making explicit that appearance or race could not be used as factors in determining who to stop. They agreed to implement enhanced training program on racial profiling and constitutional rights for all agents. They agreed to create improved oversight system where complaints about agent conduct would be reviewed by an independent panel rather than just internal investigators. Crucially, the settlement did not include a confidentiality clause. Keisha was free to speak about her experience and about the settlement terms. The government had to issue a public statement acknowledging that their agents' conduct had been improper and that they were taking steps to ensure similar incidents didn't occur in the future. It wasn't a full admission of liability with all the words Keisha's team would have preferred, but it was public acknowledgement that meant far more than the typical neither admit nor deny settlement language governments normally insisted on. When the settlement terms were announced, reaction from civil rights communities was broadly positive. Advocacy organizations praised Keisha for holding firm to her principles and refusing to accept a settlement that would have silenced her or that didn't include structural reform components. Some criticized that the policy changes didn't go far enough, that an agency promising to do better wasn't the same as externally enforced oversight, but most acknowledged that given the realities of how litigation settlements work, Keisha had achieved remarkable results. Others who had experienced racial profiling but never had resources to fight back expressed gratitude that someone with Keisha's platform had taken this fight and won. The two agents faced their final consequences shortly after the settlement was finalized. Kraus was officially terminated from ICE with wording that would make it extremely difficult for him to obtain future employment in law enforcement. Morrison was allowed to resign rather than be fired, but his enforcement certification was suspended, and he was effectively barred from federal enforcement careers. Several supervisors who had ignored previous complaints also faced disciplinary actions, ranging from demotions to mandatory training to formal letters of reprimand in their personnel files. The message throughout. The agency was clear. The kind of behavior Kraus and Morrison had exhibited would no longer be tolerated, and supervisors who allowed it to continue would share accountability. 5 years after that April morning in the supermarket parking lot, Keisha's life had changed in ways she could never have predicted when she was loading groceries into her car and was approached by two federal agents. She still practiced civil rights law, but now with almost exclusive focus on cases involving immigration, enforcement misconduct, and racial profiling. Her own experience had given her unique perspective and credibility that made her an exceptionally effective attorney for others who faced similar treatment. Clients came to her specifically because they knew she understood not just the law, but also the personal trauma of being targeted based purely on appearance. The lawsuit settlement had provided her with financial resources to expand her practice and take on more pro bono cases than would otherwise be possible. She had hired 2 junior attorneys and a paralegal, building a small firm focused exclusively on civil rights with particular specialization in immigration, enforcement issues. Together, they had represented over 100 clients in the years since her own case, winning settlements and verdicts that collectively totaled several $1 million and more. Importantly, forcing changes in enforcement practices across multiple jurisdictions. Each case was built on the precedent her own lawsuit had established, using the same legal strategies and pointing to the same constitutional violations. The policy reforms ICE had agreed to implement as part of Keisha's settlement had mixed effects. The agency had indeed revised its written policies on stops in public spaces, adding explicit language that racial appearance could not be considered as a factor in enforcement decisions. They had implemented a new training program that all agents had to complete annually, focusing on constitutional rights, racial profiling, and de-escalation techniques. And they had created an independent review panel that included community members to evaluate complaints. About agent conduct. In theory, these changes should have prevented future incidents like what happened to Keisha. In practice, implementation was inconsistent. Some field offices and supervisors took the new policies seriously, conducting the training meaningfully and actually changing how operations were conducted. Others treated the reforms as a box-checking exercise, doing the bare minimum necessary to be in technical compliance while continuing essentially the same practices as before. Advocacy organizations monitoring compliance reported that while there were improvements in some areas, there were still regular cases of ICE agents conducting stops that appeared to be motivated by racial profiling. The systemic problem Keisha's case had exposed wasn't completely solved simply because an agency promised to do better. But the case had changed the conversation in important ways. When new cases of racial profiling by ICE agents emerged, they received more media attention than they would have before. Civil rights organizations had an established framework to respond quickly, offering legal representation and connecting victims with resources. And perhaps most significantly, more people knew their rights. Keisha's case had become an educational tool widely shared in immigrant communities, teaching people they didn't have to answer questions from federal agents unless there was legal basis for interrogation, that they could politely refuse to provide information, and that if their rights were violated, there were pathways to seek justice. The body cam footage from Keisha's case, now part of public record, was used in police academies and federal training programs across the country as an example of what not to do. Instructors would pause at key moments, showing how the agents escalated the situation unnecessarily, how they failed to articulate legal cause for the stop, how their own words betrayed they were operating based on assumptions about appearance rather than legitimate suspicion. Some agents who watched the training came away genuinely impacted, realizing how their own unconscious biases could lead them to make the same mistakes. Others remained skeptical, seeing the training as political correctness that made their jobs harder. Thomas Rivera, the attorney who had become a central figure in the case after representing Keisha through the lawsuit, had become one of the leading national voices on immigration enforcement reform. He wrote a book about the case titled Profiled: One Lawyer's Fight Against ICE that became a bestseller and was used as a text in constitutional law courses at dozens of universities. He appeared regularly on news programs and podcasts discussing civil rights issues. And he worked with legislators at federal and state levels to develop legislation that would increase oversight of immigration enforcement and make it easier for victims of racial profiling to hold accountable agents who violated their rights. Some of this proposed legislation passed, though in watered-down forms after political processes. Several states implemented their own laws requiring data collection on ICE stops on public property, allowing statistical analysis that could identify patterns of racial profiling. Some municipalities passed ordinances limiting how federal agents could operate within city limits, requiring they obtain judicial warrants before conducting operations in certain public locations. The federal government, under pressure from both civil rights advocates and some lawmakers, established commissions to study enforcement practices and recommend reforms, though critics argued these commissions often produced reports that led to little substantive change. Margaret Sullivan, the elderly woman who had been one of the first witnesses to speak up for Keisha, became an unlikely activist in her retirement years. She joined the local ACLU chapter, participated in protests demanding police reform, and began giving talks at schools about civil rights and the importance of witnesses being willing to speak up when they saw injustice. She often told the story of being in that parking lot that morning, seeing Keisha being harassed, and making the decision not to just walk past, but to stop and document what was happening. She told audiences that ordinary witnesses had the power to change outcomes simply by being willing to see, record, and report truth. Carlos Mendoza, the business owner who had questioned the agents and been threatened for doing so, also remained involved in advocacy work. He used his own experience of multiple encounters with immigration enforcement, despite being an American-born citizen, to connect with others in his community who lived with similar fear. He organized workshops where civil rights attorneys like Keisha taught people about their rights and what to do if stopped by federal agents. He worked with community organizations to create rapid response networks where volunteers would respond to help anyone facing a potentially illegal stop or detention. Officer James Carter, the local policeman who had intervened and helped Keisha in the parking lot, received recognition from civil rights organizations for his actions that day. He was promoted to sergeant and placed in charge of officer training in his department, specifically focusing on interactions with federal agencies and protecting constitutional rights. He developed curriculum that included Keisha's case as a study, teaching local officers they had not just the right, but the obligation to intervene when they witnessed federal agents or any law enforcement violating someone's rights. His own department implemented policies requiring officers to report and document any problematic interactions they witnessed involving federal agencies operating in their jurisdiction. Keisha's career became defined by that moment in the parking lot in ways she sometimes found challenging. She was often introduced as the lawyer who sued ICE, or the racial profiling victim who won $1 million settlement, labels that captured aspects of her story but reduced the multifaceted person she was. She spoke openly about this tension, about how being known primarily for having been victimized was complicated even when she was grateful for the platform it gave her to create change. She emphasized she wasn't unique or special, just someone who had been lucky enough to have legal knowledge, resources, and video evidence that many victims of racial profiling never had. She also spoke honestly about the lasting impact the incident had on her mental health and well-being. Even years later, she sometimes experienced anxiety when she saw federal agents in public spaces. She developed hypervigilance about being watched or followed. She had occasional nightmares about variations of what could have happened if things had escalated differently that day. Therapy had helped, as had the activism and legal work that transformed trauma into purpose. But she wanted people to understand that winning a lawsuit didn't magically erase the psychological harm of being targeted and threatened based on race. Keisha had married and started a family in the years since the incident. Her husband, also an attorney who worked in criminal defense, had been a source of support through the entire legal process and advocacy work that followed. They had a daughter now, a beautiful 2-year-old girl who was still too young to understand what her mother had been through, but who would grow up knowing these stories. Keisha sometimes thought about what kind of world her daughter would inherit, whether she would live in an America where Black people could shop for groceries without fearing they'd be stopped and questioned by federal agents based on nothing but their appearance. The supermarket where it all happened was still there, and Keisha occasionally still shopped there, though she always felt a knot in her stomach when she pulled into the parking lot. The manager from that store had retired, but the new manager knew the story and always greeted Keisha warmly when she came in. The store had become a kind of unofficial landmark in the community, the place where that lawyer had been stopped by ICE and then won over $1 million proving her rights had been violated. Some customers stopped Keisha when they recognized her, thanking her for being willing to fight, sharing their own stories of encounters with law enforcement. Krause and Morrison, the the two agents whose actions had triggered everything, disappeared from public view after losing their jobs. Kraus reportedly moved to a different state and found work in an unrelated field, his Google search permanently dominated by articles about the case. Morrison had tried to appeal his termination through the union, but was unsuccessful. The body cam evidence was too damning for even the best union lawyers to overcome. Neither ever publicly apologized or demonstrated any understanding that their actions had been wrong. For them, apparently, they were victims of political correctness and changing standards that made law enforcement impossible. The lack of any genuine remorse from the two agents was a reminder about why systemic changes were so important. You couldn't rely on individual officers to develop moral conscience. You had to have policies, training, oversight, and accountability that forced compliance with constitutional standards regardless of agents' personal attitudes. Keisha's case had contributed to that accountability framework, making it slightly harder for future agents to engage in blatant racial profiling without facing consequences. 10 years after the incident, a civil rights group organized an event commemorating the anniversary of the case and its impact on immigration advocacy and enforcement reform. Keisha was the keynote speaker, addressing an audience of hundreds, including many of the people who had been involved in her case, lawyers, witnesses, advocates, and numerous victims of racial profiling who had been inspired by her story to stand up for themselves. She spoke about the journey from trauma to action, about how the anger and humiliation she felt in that parking lot had been channeled into legal work and advocacy that helped hundreds of others. She acknowledged that victories had been imperfect, that policy changes hadn't gone as far as they needed to, that too many people still faced racial profiling without resources to fight back. But she also celebrated what had been achieved, the legal precedents established, the lives changed, the raised awareness about issues many people had ignored before. She thanked the witnesses who had spoken up when they had no obligation to, the lawyers who worked on her case, the advocates who transformed her individual story into a broader movement for change. And she passed the microphone to others whose stories deserved to be heard. A young black man who had been stopped by ICE agents just a year ago and used Keisha's case as a model for how to respond, refusing to answer questions without legal basis, and then suing when his rights were violated. A Latina woman who worked as a nurse and had been targeted on her way to work, but who fought back with support from civil rights organizations that had grown stronger after Keisha's case. A college student of Middle Eastern descent who had used Keisha's body cam footage in a class project about racial profiling and then became a civil rights advocate himself. These stories were the true measure of impact, not the $1 million settlement or national headlines, but the ways Keisha's case had empowered others to stand up for their rights, to refuse to accept discrimination as inevitable, and to demand accountability from agents who abused their power. Each person who refused to be intimidated, each witness who recorded evidence, each lawyer who took a case that might have been ignored. They were all building on the foundation Keisha's case had helped establish. The most enduring legacy wasn't in any policy change or legal settlement, though those mattered. It was in the shift of consciousness, the growing public recognition that racial profiling by federal agents was real and documented and unconstitutional. It was in the willingness of more people in communities of color to assert their rights, and of more witnesses to intervene when they saw injustice. It was in the growing network of lawyers, advocates, and organizations committed to holding law enforcement accountable when they crossed constitutional lines. Keisha finished her remarks at that anniversary event with a reflection on what the supermarket parking lot that April morning had taught her. She said she had learned that knowing your rights was power, but that it required courage to exercise those rights when confronted by authority. She had learned that ordinary witnesses had extraordinary power to change outcomes when they were willing to see, record, and report truth. She had learned that oppressive systems didn't change because people in power suddenly developed conscience, but because people who were targeted refused to accept that oppression silently. And she had learned that even when you win, even when you get justice in ways many victims never do, the fight continues. Because her case was never really just about her. It was about every black person, every Latino person, every person of color who lives with the knowledge they could be stopped, questioned, harassed, or worse based on nothing but their appearance. It was about building a world where her daughter and all children could grow up without that fear, where constitutional rights truly belong to everyone, regardless of race or ethnicity. Keisha Matthews' story began with a moment of racial profiling in a supermarket parking lot. It became about so much more than that, a piece in the broader movement for racial justice, accountability, and recognition that even in America, even with all its promises of freedom and equality, people of color still had to fight for basic rights that should be undeniable. Her case didn't solve all those problems, but it contributed in significant and measurable ways to the ongoing struggle for those rights. And in that, there was victory even amid the recognition of how much work still remained to be done.